Russian armed forces continue to advance at various parts along the front line, while there is an accusation that Russian soldiers used Ukrainian prisoners of war as human shields. We look into this accusation, we have some geolocalization, and according to that, just to spoiler it in advance somewhat, I do not think that this accusation in this term, in this instance, is actually true, even though there are some questions still open. But at least the geolocalization doesn't really look like this. But again, we'll talk about this in this situation report, as well as about the other developments along the front line and in the home fronts of both sides. The Russians continued their air attacks on Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian targets. The intensity of them is varying somewhat. Sometimes they reach roughly 50 missiles, cruise missiles, and Shahid loitering munitions. At other days, it's less than 20. So while the intensity varies quite significantly, we still haven't seen the expected big air offensive that was to come this winter, at least according to the expectations of most observers, as the Russians clearly are stockpiling their cruise missiles. So we'll have to see when it comes, maybe coming week when the Christmas celebrations are in Ukraine, as Ukraine has just recently switched over, as far as I remember, from the Julian calendar to the Georgian in another demonstrative break from the Russian tradition to now celebrate Christmas as the rest of Europe does, not like the Russians do somewhere at the beginning of January. Still though, that we'll have to see and observe. So let's go to the front line. The Russians have been somewhat successful in this area here in the forest south of Liman Pershi. They gained a few hundred meters here. And we have a geolocalization here from Sinkivka, where the Russians reached that point. Recently, we've seen them here. So that's like 100 meters further south, maybe 120. Nothing serious overall, but still an advance by the Russians. Other than that, along the whole front line here, I cannot confirm fresh changes, so let's not waste our time and go directly south of the Seversky Donetsk. Here at Spirne, the Russians managed to advance in this area here. They're getting closer to Spirne itself, and at Saku Ivanseti, they managed to advance. We see this piece here, and this is the geolocalization of Russian troops. So we see it's basically at the tip of this hook here over on the road. The Russians have been recently spotted here, so we can expect that probably this whole area is now under Russian control as well. Again, maybe 100 to 200 meters, but still some advance overall. There was a recent video of tank fighting, recently published video, that's how I have to say, of a Ukrainian T-64BV tank destroying a Russian T-72B3. It happened exactly here. It shoots from this direction up here, but the area isn't snowy, so that video seems to be somewhat older, probably at least a month, if not a little bit more. It's unclear of that, but I cannot confirm any additional changes in the control of territory over the last 3 days in this area. Also here at Klishivka, they are still holding that piece of the elevation above Klishivka. Some Russian military bloggers claim that Klishivka is partially surrounded. Technically, you could probably say that they are beginning to see the first signs of a cauldron, but we do not see anything close to this actually happening in a timely manner. Overall, the front line doesn't seem to have changed over the last 3 days in this area. Further south, though, it has changed. This area here is a waste heap of the Gagarin mine, which was recently reconquered by the Ukrainians. This was significant in a moral way, as this was the line of control since 2014-15, since the major fighting then ended until the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And here the Ukrainians managed to cross over on the previously held Russian territory and plant their flag there, but the Russians returned and took the flag down, so the Ukrainians have lost that area as well. Further down at Avdiivka, we have a lot of changes in favor of the Russians. They have managed to advance into that tree line to the north of Sepove, and they managed to cross the railroad bridge along that whole area. I do not see that they have significantly advanced further north in this area, but they have definitely crossed over here and are now threatening Stepove from the north as well as from the east and somewhat from the south. Fighting is also continuing towards the coke plant, but I do not see any changes here. Also no changes at the water treatment plant and the Dachas, but we do have changes further to the southeast. The Russians managed to advance through that little forested area and have now definitely entered Avdiivka at the very southeast of the city. They are now, the house-to-house fighting has begun in this overall area. In total, they advanced by 540 meters over the last 3 days. So in the relative terms of this current phase of the war, a fairly sizable advance that the Russians managed to achieve there. We have another change in territory. We see, let me see, is this here? This was Spirne. No, this was Spirne here. Yeah, I'm sorry. We've seen that at Spirne, and this is Stepove. Here we can see where they have recently advanced. I forgot to show that to you. This is the advance of 540 meters at the area of Avdiivka, and the Russians have now been spotted at this point. Now it's easy to identify. This is towards Pervomaiske, and as we can see, it's on the westernmost tip of that water here. So the Russians are now at this position as well. They have advanced somewhat further in this direction. They also managed to advance roughly in this area here towards Nevelske. So an additional advance and quite sizable advances, again in relative terms, at Marinka. Marinka is now fully under control in the southern part, and in the northern part they roughly advanced along this whole area here towards the west by several hundred meters. Just need to find it now. We have the videos here of them, which is geolocalized, and you can see the furthest advance where the Ukrainians strike them is at this position. So at this, until this very point, the Russians managed to advance. Technically, we are probably still talking about Marinka. Overall, I guess Marinka will probably be more or less up till here, but as you can see, we are now talking about really the low one-digit percentiles of control about Marinka. The fall of the rest of the city is a question of days now, not much longer, at least when we see the overall situation here. The Russians were also further able to show successes towards the south here. We have them advancing directly into Novomikhailivka. I have that here, a geolocalization. They have advanced in this area and up till here, again getting closer towards Novomikhailivka, and at the same time they advanced in the north over the last couple of days here towards Pobieda. So Novomikhailivka is increasingly in danger of being cut off. And should the Ukrainians being pushed further back to the west, then obviously the lines of communication towards Vuhledar will be threatened, and the whole front line here will increasingly be in danger, and thus allowing the Russians the option to use that railroad line again, at least in some midterm future, if they manage to push the Ukrainians far enough back. We're probably talking about an area that they have to push them back more or less until here for them to realistically be able to use that railroad line again. But now with some movement in that area, we do see that Russia is increasingly getting a chance to reach that point in a reasonable future, if they can keep up their offensive activity. Further west, some fighting at Staromayorsk, some at Priutne, no change in territory. South of Orikhiv, I have some Russian claims that they managed to get closer towards Robotine. I do not see any proof of this, and other than that, I do not see any change in territory there whatsoever that I can confirm. So let's not waste our time and continue right over to the Dnipro. Here, the Dnipro, the change is the same. No change in territory. I have Russian middle bloggers saying that the Ukrainians advanced towards the east, so either up here or in that area, but that they withdrew later. So no change in territory. Some Russian mill bloggers claim that they managed to push the Ukrainians somewhat back inside of Krinky. No visual evidence there. So for us, the situation here seems to be more or less unchanged. Now comes the part that you're probably all interested in. There is this, for instance, is from a Ukrainian source, which references a video where you see a Russian soldier and a Ukrainian soldier going directly behind each other. Unfortunately, I can't show the video to you. I'm going to link it in the comment, so you can watch it yourself, as YouTube isn't too happy about me showing stuff like this. But basically you see a Russian soldier leading a Ukrainian, and at some point a Russian soldier shoots next to the Ukrainian, but still being probably 10, 15 to 20 meters away. Then you see a mortar shell hill. Then the Ukrainian soldiers run in this direction. Initially, they walk towards the right on this picture. Then they run towards the left, and a Russian soldier shoots one of the Ukrainians. Now, I checked where it actually is. I found a geolocalization, and this is the deep state map from that very day, because it is on November 29th, according at least to the inscription on the video, where the front line was like this. And it was geolocalized to this very lane here. And they are walking towards the south, towards more or less Verbove, which is in Russian hands. This doesn't make sense to use them as a human shield. If they had been caught walking along this tree line towards the Ukrainian line, it would have made sense. And the other thing is, while the Russian soldiers keep some distance from each other, which makes perfect military sense, only in that one case is a Ukrainian soldier right in front of a Russian. Other than that, they are keeping somewhat distances. And if you are a shooter yourself, you know that at least if you have calm nerves, at 500 meters, 20 meters in difference is absolutely manageable. So if you see a soldier of your own forces and 20 meters apart is one of the opponent's forces, then you can actually engage the enemy without threatening the life of your own, at least if you're somewhat of a decent shot and somewhat do know what you're doing. So if we see them, and you're gonna watch the video yourself likely, you see that one of them might use them as a human shield, but the direction they are marching is not towards the front line, but rather away. Then the mortar shells hit. Then the three Ukrainians run away on the northern part here, on that route. And they get shot. Somebody shoots after them, and one of them seems to be dead at that point. Now, my understanding, I'm not an expert on international law, and I'm not an expert on the Geneva Convention, but I do know that it's common practice to shoot towards fleeing prisoners, prisoners of war, as well as even inside of prisons. Weapons are being used on those trying to break out. So shooting one while he's running away with the accusation that he tried to flee from his prison, from being a prisoner of war, is probably legitimate. I'm not completely sure, but I cannot, if you watch the video and see the geolocalization, which you can see in this context here, when you see the geolocalization, then it doesn't make sense that this would be a prisoner of war being led as a human shield, as the geolocalization says it exactly to point it here, and they are walking towards the south, whereas the front line is more or less here in 800 meters distance, more or less. The Ukrainian positions have probably been in this tree line here, so even one tree line away. And unless they are being caught walking in this direction, I do not see them being used as human shield. Now, on this channel, we talked about Russian war crimes whenever they are being shown, whenever they are getting known. We've talked about Ukrainian war crimes as well, whenever I've became aware of them. And recently, for instance, I talked about the 2 Ukrainian soldiers that were killed by Russians at Stepove, here at the in the battle for Avdiivka, where we saw a video of 2 Ukrainians coming out of a position and then being shot by the Russians. This happened here. Unless the video was fairly grainy, unless there is a reasonable claim that one of them maybe held a hand grenade ready to throw it. It actually looked like the Russians killed those 2 prisoners of war without any reason. We're talking about this here, but at the same time, we should try to stay with the facts. And if I watch this video, I do not see them abusing them as prisoners of war, abusing them as human shields. So in my verdict, it's likely that it hasn't happened. Likely, I do not say it's my final verdict, and this is the absolute truth, because while this geolocalization seems to be proper, while the details that are being shown here, as you can see, while we see that it's very likely the truth, I still don't have the final consequences of whatever happened there and so on. But if you watch the video, and I said I'm going to link it to you, you will probably come to the same conclusion here. Again, no intention of sugarcoating anything, no intention of excusing anything, but I'll try to stick to the facts. Whether some people are pleased about this or not, I can imagine what some of the comments will be down there. I see them every time I do anything but hooray messages for Ukraine. Some of my viewers apparently assume that you have to never criticize Ukraine, or you're a traitor or a turncoat or whatever. Let's continue with the text itself. The Ukrainians, or with the situation report, the Ukrainians have hit a shopping center in Mariupol, and locals say that it caused secondary explosions. The Ukrainians say that SAMs had been stored there, or I think it was a local who said that on the parking lot there were likely air defense systems, missiles that were blown up with this attack here in Mariupol. And just recently we also have the news that in Donetsk, here in the city, apparently, or in the outskirts of the city, the Ukrainians struck an oil depot, several big explosions, big fire that is happening here as well. And partisans have blown up a railroad line in Mariupol. Reports are also exploding the train, and the train is supposed to transport ammunition in this. Supposedly the train blew up as well. When it comes to troop generation, we have some news from Chuvash. The Chuvash Republic is going to give 150,000 rubles to foreigners as a bonus if they get hired under a contract by the Russian Armed Forces. That's roughly what, $1,500, $1,600. That's going to be a signing bonus if you don't have the Russian citizenship. And in his direct line PR thing, where Putin had an interview and was responding to questions from the audience that was obviously pre-selected, he talked about 617,000 soldiers in the combat zone. 617,000 Russian soldiers. Combat zone probably has to be interpreted as more or less everything somewhat close to the front line. This might be soldiers here in Bryansk, Kursk, Belgorod, Rostov, maybe in theory somebody manning an S-400 in Taganrog is obviously in some degree in the combat zone as well, especially as Russia considers those 5 Ukrainian oblasts as being part of the Russian territory. So in theory, for Russia, there shouldn't be a difference between this province and this province, at least by their own accords. Also, he claimed that 244,000 of the 300,000 partially mobilized are in that area. Question is obviously what happened to the other 56,000. How many of those have already been casualties and how many of them are in the back areas, but we don't have any informations. As said, the numbers are probably including everyone in the rear areas as well, and the numbers don't seem to be that far off of reality, as we need to understand that Ukraine said in the past already that they have 1 million men in uniform, and it's expected that roughly 800,000 of those are in the Ukrainian armed forces, and we do not see a Ukrainian significant superiority overall in manpower. On the other hand, au contraire, the Ukrainians complain often that when the Russians are attacking, they are doing so with superior numbers. That obviously leads to the conclusion that the Russians must have far more men now in the overall area than they initially had. And obviously, the Ukrainians don't have their 800,000 along that part of the front line either. There are soldiers and armed forces all over the country, including guarding the borders towards Russia and Belarus, as well as to Transnistria. They man air defense systems all over the country, etc., etc. Just some numbers that we have. We shouldn't take them too serious, but so obviously with some grain of salt. But overall, the numbers don't seem to be off by orders of magnitudes from the reality. Putin also claimed that Russia has recruited over in the year 2023. It has recruited 486,000 men. Those would supposedly all be volunteers. The numbers are more or less in line to what Dmitry Medvedev said before. I said in the past, we shouldn't expect that this number is exactly true, because you would usually exaggerate a little bit, but the numbers on the front line, despite the losses, which we do know that they have to be severe, even if we just look at the pictures of fields of corpses lying around, and we do not see the Russian armed forces being understaffed in this part of the war. So obviously recruitment must work well enough, and that makes it reasonable that 400,000 or somewhat more than that might actually have been recruited. Also, in the political sphere, we have some news. Russia has, for the first time, taken away citizenship of naturalized citizens, according to a new law that was introduced basically became active in October this year. Two of those were two immigrants were stripped of their citizenship after they have been sentenced for drug trade. Now they've lost their Russian citizenship. And in the Direct Line interview, Putin mentioned the war of Ukraine in very big terms, in a huge percentage, showing its importance, but at the same time obviously demonstrating that he doesn't think the Russian public has serious enough problems to hurt him if he doesn't sugarcoat it, if he mentions that it's a long struggle, if he acknowledges all the consequences. In his remarks, he made it clear that Russia has changed nothing about its war aims. It's still neutrality of Ukraine. It's still so-called denazification, which basically means regime change. It is still a demilitarization, which means that Ukraine is supposed to be without the means to be able to defend itself. And obviously, Russia has no intention to step back from its territorial claims that are far inside of Ukraine. Now even there's a German tabloid publishing maps that supposedly Russia more or less wants to capture this year until the end of the coming year, and this year until the end of 25, more or less, from Dnipro up to Kharkiv, Belgorod, that line, that Russia aims to capture more or less this part of Ukraine in the next 2 years. Also, all of this shows us that if you want negotiations, peace negotiations for Ukraine that are anything but a capitulation, then Ukraine needs to improve its military situation. At the current position, Russia and Putin are convinced that they are winning the war, so they have no rational reason to negotiate anything away that they think they can take by force if the Ukrainian military doesn't seem to be able to stop them doing so. The also news in this regard, or somewhat in this regard, Ukraine has now, the European Union has now started its membership negotiations with Ukraine. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is against that, but he left the room to after the German Chancellor proposed this to him. So this allowed him basically to save face and to keep his veto to stop him from stopping the European Union to open the membership negotiations, while not stepping back from what he said before. I think probably a fairly elegant solution and politics at its workings, as we see that the European Union has the problem in a certain regard, at least you would want to call it a problem, that every decision like this needs to be unanimous. For Hungary, it's not really a big deal, as they will still have the opportunity to stop Ukraine from joining at a later point, as it will still require unanimous support. So now he has opened the door, and but he's at the same time, he's still blocking 50 billion of financial aid towards Ukraine until the European Union gives Hungary what Orban thinks it's due. Basically, he's blackmailing the European Union. Give me the money I want, or I won't sign off on the European Union giving money to Ukraine. And aid, giving something to Ukraine. We have also some news in this regard. Denmark has said they are going to send a new aid package to Ukraine at the value of 1.1 billion euros. Among that is ammunition, drones, and tanks, likely more Leopard 1D case. In this regard, Norway has promised additional air defense, probably NASAMS. Sweden is going to send a winter package for the infrastructure, and Finland is also preparing a next aid package with military contents, and they want to double their current ammunition production. Germany has announced a new package with a Patriot system and missiles, 40 and 155 millimeter grenades, and mine sweeping equipment, as well as drone sensors. And on top of that, a package of 6.1 million. That's what I read, even though that some seems to be somewhat small, but supposedly with generators, tents, and heating devices for the coming winter. And we see Javier Milei's first foreign policy change that he announced, as he basically said he wants to have Argentina leaning towards the West and Israel, US and Israel, as well as move away from communist regimes like China, for instance. And at least according to that page here, the Argentinians are going to hand over 2 Mi-171Es to Ukraine. They are not in service right now, probably because of spare parts running low. They are basically versions of the Mi-8 transport helicopter that Argentina is operating, and those two are not in operation, so they are useless for the Argentinian armed forces anyways, but obviously a massive step for Argentina, which so far has not given Ukraine any military aid. And this is basically military aid, either as spare part donations, or the Ukrainians will be able to get them running again and then be able to use them for transport and ground attacks. And Ukraine basically has its own Shahid now. We're talking about drones this year. This has been developed locally in Ukraine by Terminal Autonomy. They say their AQ400 Skies is currently in production, 100 a month. Its cruising speed is 144 kilometers an hour, range up to 750 kilometers, and the warhead 32 kilos, or if the range is reduced up to 70 kilometers, and they want to produce 500 a month in the near future. So if you look at the pictures, you basically see a Ukrainian Shahid that is going to be used to strike the rear areas of Russia as well. 500 a month is obviously far away from what the Russians produce in Shahid now. We basically have daily attacks with 20 to 50, so you can calculate yourself that the production numbers of the Russians are probably reaching 1,000 Shahids a month. But at least we see some speculations in the past. Why can't Ukraine develop their own Shahids? Well, there you have it, and that's it. And that's it for now as well. If you like this report, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment. What do you think about the human shield usage, especially after you watch the video? As said, I'm going to link it to you downstairs so you can get your own impression. And I'm going to link the geolocalization to that as well, so you can check it out on the map yourself and decide whether I'm right or wrong. Leave a comment about this. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. And this channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. So thank you to everyone already supporting this channel. And if you want to support it, you can do so by the means in the description. And that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.